Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Trollopians, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about one of my favourite novelists in this beautiful room. I'm very well aware that many, if not most of you, know far more about our hero's work than I do. My only excuse for this presumption is that I am a novelist, often compared to him, and that I too write about the way we live now, have a cast of recurring characters, and am particularly interested in moral dilemmas. However, I want to begin with a brief outline of how Anthony Trollope changed my life. Many of you here probably discovered him through the BBC dramatisation of the Palliser series in the 1970s, but sadly I missed these. At Cambridge, where I read English literature, Trollope was definitely beyond the pale. He'd been dismissed by Leaverside academics as belonging to the Silver Fork school, and so I thought I could give him a miss. I really did believe that money should not matter if you had the brains and education to earn your own. But I was about to find out, most painfully, that it did. Very briefly, the young man I'd been in love with for 2 years ditched me for someone rich, whom he later married. It was an excruciating experience, especially as I was given to understand that even more than my inconvenient belief in fidelity, my being without a trust fund meant that I was disposable. Soon after, in the middle of a deep recession and a freezing winter, I lost my job and my confidence. I spent over a year working as a cleaner in order to pay the rent on my damp, unheated room in Camden Town. Partly to keep warm, partly to find better employment, and partly not to sink into complete misery, I haunted my local library. One day, I picked up the best corrective in the world to my wounded feelings, the Eustace Diamonds. It was not only the start of a lifelong passion for Trollope, it opened my eyes concerning the twin powers of money and love. At just 22, I'd not even begun to think about marriage. Much of what Trollope's characters discuss, struck me as shockingly venal, and yet, in the light of my recent experience, dreadfully honest. The Eustace Diamonds, as I'm sure you all know, seems an immensely worldly and is very funny novel. Its heroine, Lizzie Eustace, is a young woman whose beauty snags a rich and aristocratic husband, knowing him to be mortally ill. And though she soon becomes a wealthy widow when he dies, she refuses to give up the diamond necklace that may or may not belong to his family. Her acquisitiveness, her lies, her manipulations and self-deceptions as she attempts to enlist the support of various suitors amuse me greatly. Unlike Thackeray's Becky Sharp, she isn't an adulteress or a murderess. She simply likes jewels. What fascinated me more, however, was a love triangle between Lizzie, her cousin Frank Greystock, and the poor governess Lucy, whom Frank loves but feels he cannot afford to marry. As is often the case when two characters have names beginning with the same letter, the two women are different faces of womanhood. Lizzie Eustace's money, cleverness, and charms give her agency, whereas Lucy suffers in dignified silence like patient Griselda, waiting for her fiancé to make their engagement public. In contrast to Lizzie's fabulous necklace, Lucy's only diamonds are her eyes, and yet her inner resources, moral scruples, and spirit means that eventually she gets her man. Love triumphs over money, and though Frank knows that he will be a poor man as a mere barrister, he is more or less true. Naturally, I found this story a balm. Most variants of Cinderella are, and it's the reason why it remains the most popular fairy tale in the world. Trollope was to recycle it many times, just as Jane Austen did before. I had read Austen, of course, but I'd not really understood that the forces at work in her world were still to be found in mine. Reading the Eustace Diamonds, I began to understand how very naive I'd been. I'm not saying that as a result of reading Trollope, I myself became fixated on finding a rich husband. Far from it. I had many more choices in that thanks to education and emancipation, I could support myself through a job, and I am a feminist. What Trollope did show me, however, was that marriage was something that I wanted, and that if I was to find a loving husband rather than a succession of disappointing partners, I had to think very hard about what qualities to look for. It was no good excusing the kind of man who sulks, sneers, and rages as a variant of Heathcliff. It was no good putting up with a feckless charmer either. I had to stop wasting my youth and affections on men who simply didn't deserve them, and find what? In Trollope's day, marriage was the only career that a respectable woman could have, apart of course from governessing, and also the speediest way for an attractive but impecunious man to make his life easy. Money and love in his work are like the twin poles in a battery, whose attraction and repulsion create the charge that powers Trollope's fiction. He shows how people might be persuaded or coerced into decisions that run contrary to their deeper selves, thanks sometimes to their watchful older relations who see only the material advantages, not the spiritual or emotional ones. Though his plots are conventional, what is amazing about them is the depth of their psychology in pursuit of these twin goals, so often incompatible. There are two times in your life, I believe, when Trollope is especially important. One is when you're middle-aged and able to look back on the choices you made in life and also appreciate his wonderfully intricate characters and plots. But the other, more crucial time is in your 20s, when you are attempting to divine how the world works. Trollope's great genius is to show how and why his characters vacillate between one choice and another, pushed and pulled by ambition, emotion, necessity, and desire. They are, as it were, a hotbed of cold feet. Above all, he understands how the right choice in marriage is critical to finding happiness, and that to go in quest of this is not sordid or demeaning, but something that deserves sober consideration as well as passionate attraction. Everyone in his novels is obsessed by money, even when they despise it. Trollope diminished his own reputation for about 100 years when he revealed in his autobiography how much money he made from his books, and yet any professional writer is both an artist and a labourer. Unless people buy our books, we can't afford to write. And I may add here that the average income for a literary writer these days, such as myself, is less than £12,000 a year. Trollope himself, as a son of a failed barrister and best-selling if scandalous mother, must always have been acutely aware of economics. His family's flight to Belgium to avoid creditors during his boyhood, his interrupted education at Winchester and Harrow, his inability to go to Oxford like his father and elder brother, and his lowly clerk's job in the post office were all driven by the lack of funds. The anguish of this kind of poverty, which of course is nothing like the terrible deprivation that Dickens and Hardy described, is still real, humiliating, and the cause of misery. If young women of gentle birth dreaded becoming a governess, almost as much as I came to dread cleaning other people's toilets, there were many, many dangers and miseries for an impecunious man. The marriage market was indeed a market in which birth, virtue, accomplishments, and looks were all given a pecuniary value. Elizabeth Bennet teases Mr. Darcy's cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, in Pride and Prejudice, when he complains that Younger sons cannot marry where they like, by asking what is the usual price an earl's younger son would be, adding, unless the elder brother is very sickly, I suppose you would not ask above £50,000. It's a joke that has a sting to it, because it's probably true. In her fiction, Austen's heroines all, as it were, buck the market by being loved and valued for their own qualities, despite the baleful effect of having too little, or in Emma Woodhouse's case, too much money. Readers of Jane Austen are still mildly shocked by the way people discuss, and thanks to published information, did know exactly how much money individual members of the gentry had to bring to a union, and where it comes from. However, she does not tell us what we now call their lifestyle costs. Trollope is the only Victorian novelist I can think of who repeatedly makes this explicit for different levels of genteel life. A couple cannot marry and live in England on £500 a year, according to Ayala's banker uncle in Ayala's Angel. But Frank Gresham's father, a landowner, is a poor man on £14,000 a year. Trollope's heroes frequently agonise on whether or not they can afford to marry on £600 a year, which is, as we know from his autobiography, what he did himself. Because this meant that according to Mrs. Beeton's household management, they could afford 3 servants. Being an MP was unpaid, unless, like Phineas Finn, you became a junior minister. That yields what sounds like a modest income, but in real life, a Victorian junior minister was paid £1,500 a year, worth approximately £222,000 today. No wonder our politicians complain about being ill-paid. Some attitudes to money have not changed. Today, we can satisfy burning curiosity by looking up on Zoopla what our friends' homes cost and what they're worth now. But in Trollope's day, actually revealing the sum was the height of ill-breeding. In Dr. Thorne, the dismal Louis Scatcherd, who's inherited his father's self-made fortune, insists on asking the company at the squire's dinner party to guess what his father's house, built on the squire's former land, cost. When they politely demur, the new baronet tells them triumphantly, £22,419, 4 shillings and 8pence. It's funny and embarrassing to a modern audience, as it must have been to a Victorian one. But becoming rich through actual labour or trade was considered to be a stain on pretensions of genteel birth, unless, that is, you were selling your children or yourself in marriage. This is the aspect of Victorian life that, like its racism, is the most alien and repugnant. One of his most chilling openings comes in The Claverings, when Julia Brabazon asks her lover, "Why should I not marry a man with a large income? You are very handsome, Harry, and you too should go into the market and make the best of yourself." With an income of £200 and debts of £600, she is determined that, as she puts it, love should not be her master. Her lover can choose a different future, being an educated man, but Julia has no choice but to be married well or go out. She marries a sickly, bald nobleman whom she does not love. And though she is a good and faithful wife to him, Trollope condemns Julia for not bringing to him what he calls a virgin heart. To the modern reader, this is hugely dismaying, and yet he can't help but sympathise with his vulnerable heroines and dramatising their plight. As he gets older, his vision darkens. The bullying of Marie Melmotte by her father in The Way We Live Now into her dreadful marriage to the gambler Sir Felix Carberry is nightmarish. Trollope expresses the depth of my scorn for women who run down husbands like foxes in a hunt, but he can't help showing us all the patience, all the courage, all the self-abnegation, and all the failure of aging husband hunters like Arabella Trefoil in The American Senator. Unlike his contemporaries, Trollope does not give us detailed descriptions of landscapes or clothes or weather or food or even houses in his books, just his characters' appearance, thoughts, conversations, feelings, and incomes. We feel their wants and their needs, the clean linen, the subscription to the circulating library, the ability to ride to hounds or stand for Parliament. And we also have a fair estimation of what is needed to afford these. In the fiction of today, money is the new sex, unmentionable. We must endure a good deal of detail about modern fictional couplings, but know nothing about how characters manage to support themselves. 150 years ago, it was the reverse. Novels told us nothing about Victorian characters' sex lives, other than perhaps by suggestive responses to nature, but an enormous amount about their income and expectations. There is a practical reason for this change, as well as the one to do with changing social mores. Thomas Piketty's book Capital points out that up to the First World War, novelists from Austen to E.M. Forster could describe specific sums of money belonging to their characters because for 100 years, from 1814 to 1914, there was very low inflation. An audience that therefore had a very good idea of what Mr. Darcy's 10,000 a year was worth. Only after the First World War, when major European governments left the gold standard, did inflation gallop away and sums like £600 or £10,000 a year lost their practical significance. One consequence of this was that money virtually disappeared from literature, not only in Europe, but in America. It took until the 1990s for the level of wealth and disposable income to stabilize and return to levels equal to those observed in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it is curious how almost as soon as this happened, the mention of money reappeared, not just in commercial fiction, but in novels like my own about the state of the nation, as writers from on both sides of the Atlantic, from Tom Wolfe to Lionel Shriver to John Lanchester, started naming the cost of living. It still remains a sensitive topic, however. It is one thing to read 50 Shades of Grey and fantasize about the immense wealth of the billionaire hero, but readers of literary fiction also deserve to know what different lifestyles currently cost. In my most recent novel, The Golden Rule, the upper-class mother-in-law of my impoverished heroine Hannah believes that the living wage is £80,000 a year. This is drawn from life. At the upper end, the lives Trollope describes of country house parties and etiquette seem so remote from our own as to constitute fantasy. However, what he describes of the young waiting to inherit some money from their relations in order for their own lives to begin has become highly topical again, as millennials find themselves unable to afford their own homes, unable to start families, or even leave the homes of their baby boomer parents. Dr. Thorne is all about this scenario. His lovers admit their love for each other almost from the start, but they cannot marry because young Frank Gresham's patrimony has been wasted by his father. All his relations tell him he must marry money, and Mary Thorne, the illegitimate niece of a provincial doctor, has neither birth nor fortune. How can the lovers remain true to each other in the face of pecuniary pressure? I confess that of all Trollope's male heroes, Dr. Thorne is the most appealing to me. His total commitment to his brother's child is magnificent, and I especially delight in the scene in which he not only faces down Frank's snobbish mother, but bests her, because he knows the rules of English etiquette better than she does. If you understand these rules, according to Trollope, you can best the daughter of an earl and outface both money and class. Madame Max in Phineas Redux is just as courageous and clever, and that is probably why I love her best of all. But the demands for the young heir to save his family from losing their home are relentless. Frank is brave and determined, so much so that he says he will find employment as a barrister or an engineer if Mary will have him. But it is Miss Dunstable, the heiress to the £200,000 fortune deriving from her father's ointment of Lebanon, who is most stern. When Frank pays half-hearted court to her, this is her response. Sell yourself for money. Why, if I were a man, I would not sell one jot of liberty for mountains of gold. What, tie myself in the heyday of my youth to a person I could never love, for a price perjure myself, destroy myself, and not only myself, but her also, in order that I might live idly? Oh heavens, Mr. Gresham, can it be that the words of such a woman as your aunt have sunk so deeply into your heart, have blackened you so foully, as to make you think of such vile folly as this? Have you forgotten your soul, your spirit, your man's energy, the treasure of your heart, and you so young? For shame, Mr. Gresham, for shame, for shame. The key to Dr. Thorne and Frank Gresham is that they cannot be bought. It is deeply satisfying that in Framley Parsonage it is a middle-aged Dr. Thorne who wins the hand and heart and fortune of Miss Dunstable, precisely because he is indifferent about money. The novelist's depiction of young women and men who seek partners who measure up to their aspirations for money and position is witheringly funny. Frank's aunt, Lady Amelia de Courcy, makes clear that money is more important than rank when she says of her own son, "We did think of Miss Dunstable for Porlock once, but when we found that it wasn't much over 200,000, why, that idea fell to the ground." Money is the magic that smooths all obstacles, even as Mary Thorne discovers illegitimacy, or as in Phineas Redux, being a Jew. In this world, marrying for love, or even allowing yourself to feel the emotion, is a luxury that can't be afforded by the poor, and this adds an almost tragic poignancy to those who must marry for money. Arabella Trefoil, in The American Senator, knew that she was heartless and that she belonged to a heartless world, but she knew also that there was a world of women who were not heartless, and it is to this second world that Arabella aspires to join. The working poor are no more free. The barmaid Nora in The Three Clerks yearns for the personal, respectable, but impecunious Charlie, but knows that it was not for her to indulge in the luxury of a heart if circumstances actually forbade it. To eat and drink and clothe herself, and if possible to provide eating and drinking and clothes for future years, this was the business of life, the only real necessity. Although Trollope makes Nora a comic character, it is typical that he gives her the dignity of letting us see how limited her choices are, not of rank, but of physical survival. Even higher up the social ladder, that fear is potent. Love is all very well, Ayala's billionaire banker uncle tells his niece in Ayala's Angel, but love should be regulated by good sense. It is a crime when two beggars think of marrying each other, two beggars who are not prepared to live as beggars do. For every Griselda Grantley trading her beauty to become Lady Dumbello in Framley Parsonage, there are potentially darker tales, such as the mental breakdown of Lucinda Roanoke in the Eustace Diamonds, pushed into an engagement with a cruel man who repels her. Women's situation, their limited agency, was a very real problem, especially before the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, which could strip a wife even of her children. In the Victorian era, the choice was binary. What a person has, rather than what they are, distorts perceptions and dehumanizes a union. We tend to think of this time as being one of upward mobility, but the fear of becoming downwardly mobile is at least as powerful, and at its root is a perfectly sensible terror of destitution. Trollope does not plumb these depths, as Dickens or Balzac or Victor Hugo did. The enchantment of his novels is that, like Jane Austen before him, he makes us believe that passion, propriety, and property can become happily intertwined in the best of all possible worlds. His lucky lovers are allowed to enter an Arcadia in which love and money will each make the other more blessed. I do not think it a coincidence that so many of us turn to the Barchester and Pallister series, as well as to the golden age of crime fiction during the pandemic. Now that we're still facing terrifying challenges, thanks to ever more acute conflicts between freedom and economy, his Arcadia remains just as comforting. Trollope's wise and kindly presence in his own novel ensures that, unlike so much contemporary fiction, we never close his books feeling worse than we did on opening them. At the same time, he shrewdly remarks on the difficulties of this. If love makes people behave in impulsive, unexpected ways, connecting us to a deeper understanding of who we truly are, money is a coercive, pushing us into what we are not. It represents the world versus the spirit, and even after the right couples have come together, they have the rest of their lives in which to still make a mess of things. Trollope, like other famous novelists of his time, asked what should a woman do with her life, but his answer was not to commit adultery. I often wonder, in fact, how he would have written the painful scene in Anna Karenina in which the heroine must choose between her lover and her child. Instead, his solution is to negotiate. For negotiations do not end even after marriage. The Proudie marriage, for instance, is a creation of comic genius because it shows this in every novel. But I also love the way that the Tappets' 30-year marriage in Rachel Ray has such a comfortable intimacy. Mrs. Tappet makes her husband a beef steak pie whenever she wants him to do something. "Ah," said he, "I wonder how much that pie is to cost me." Everybody recognizes that, I think. Marriage in a Trollope novel is not about romance, nor is it just a social or religious contract. It is the fulcrum of an individual life, the event that shows us what a character is really made of. Trollope does not have the sublime moral clarity of George Eliot, or the fulminating sense of social injustice with which Dickens sent lightning blasts into the murky underworld. What he has is a vivid sense of the gigantic conflict that he understood and even enjoyed in himself. It is this which gives such depth and animation to his best characters. He was a liberal who could see the point of conservatives, a rare gift even today. His instinctive conservatism regarding class, sex, marriage, religion, and even race is shot through with compassion and respect for human beings. Henry James is often quoted saying that Trollope had a complete appreciation of the usual, and to the modern ear this tends to sound rather sneery. But the important adjective is, I believe, complete. His characters strike us as so real and sympathetic because they are complete and dramatise how we too might react to a situation and to specific circumstances with those we know. For though love remains a constant force in the lives of men and women, so too does the need or greed for money. When Frank Greystock finally takes the plunge with poor Lucy in the Eustace diamonds, he's treated by her affectionate friends the Fawns as a hero. An unmarried man who is willing to sacrifice himself is in feminine eyes always worthy of ribbons and a chaplet. All his sins were forgiven him. There he was, in the guise of a declared lover, and the fatted calf was killed. And he is a hero. He's not going to starve as a barrister, but he's probably never going to be comfortable. Trollope himself was not exactly a catch. Though of good family, he was the son of a bankrupt, and he knew he had to work very hard for his bread. He was not what he called a curled darling, and even the lowly job he obtained in the post office came through family connection, not obvious brilliance. He had almost everything against him, including his embarrassing surname. Yet he succeeded, both as an energetic post office employee who invented the postbox, as crucial to social intercourse as the mobile phone is today, and as one of the highest paid novelists of his day. But he was never, I think, not conscious of his own absence of personal attractions. I find it touching how often, as a plain man, overweight, balding, short-sighted, and covering up for his rough manners with bluster, he describes the advantages of male beauty to the impecunious hero. I know that members of the society have been studying Can You Forgive Her? And to me its most painful scene is when Burgo is accosted in Oxford Street by a prostitute of about 16. "You are cold," said he, trying to speak to her cheerily. "Cold," she said, repeating the word and striving to wrap herself closer in her rags as she shivered. "Oh, God, if you knew what it was to be as cold as I am nothing in the world, not one penny, not a hole to lie in." "We are alike then," said Burgo, with a slight, low laugh. "I also have nothing. You cannot be poorer than I am." "You poor," she said, and then she looked up into his face. "Gracious, how beautiful you are. Such as you are never poor." Only in one of his last and loveliest novels, Ayala's Angel, does Trollope make his hero ugly. Though his ugliness mostly consists of having bright red hair and a wide mouth, which few today would consider defects, he also has an unattractive surname. All of these are sufficient for the heroine to reject her suitor. A reworking both of Sense and Sensibility and of Beauty and the Beast, Ayala's Angel is deeply satisfying and, in its way, romantic. Ayala, the penniless but beautiful daughter of a spendthrift artist, is courted both by the spoilt son of her billionaire banker uncle and by the ugly but charming Colonel Stubbs. The latter wins his idealistic bride's heart by refusing to return the unprovoked blow given him by his rival in love, and by having a robust sense of humour. To act nobly but discreetly is the essence of the Trollopian hero, just as to endure an uncertain future with spirited dignity is that of the Trollopian heroine. I have said that reading Trollope changed my life, and indeed he helped me to realise many things, not least that if you do wish to marry for love, it's best to start looking when young, and to accept that you will both be poor for a long time to come. It was thanks to him that I came to realise my broken heart was in fact a huge stroke of good luck, both for myself and for my former lover, whose 2 marriages, unlike my own, did not last. For the mark of true love is not, as romantics believe, to fall in love truly, madly and deeply, but to fall in love truly, sanely and deeply with someone worth having. I learnt through Trollope what to look for, which is not money or title or looks, but courage, good sense, empathy, kindness, hard work, fidelity, and a sense of humour. It is also, of course, best to find a partner who reads Trollope, because I have yet to meet anyone who loves this author who is deficient in these qualities. Readers, I married him.